Hello Assassins, this is Gargudon for the ones who came before, and welcome. 2011's Assassin's Creed Revelations took on the gargantuan task of concluding one of the most iconic trilogies and narratives in all of gaming. Something it did in a decently satisfying and full circle way, more or less, to say the least. The game brought us some of the most action-packed missions of the Ezio trilogy and the franchise overall, took us to a beautiful new part of the world, and concluded the stories of Altaïr, Ibn-La'Ahad and Ezio Auditore in a powerful way. In a way, it was also the end of one era of the franchise, saying goodbye to these characters and their stories, undergoing a graphic and stylistic change with the next game, some original fans thinking this could have been the final installment overall. Had it been, it would have gone out in style. When I say the game did all this merely decently, I'm, as you can hear, not necessarily talking about the narrative and story of the game itself, but rather the playing experience. How some missions were as action-packed as can be, and others kind of felt too short and simple, and how Constantinople lacked some of the fun gameplay elements and world charm that the predecessors' portrayal of Rome delivered in style. Welcome to this in-depth exploration of how Assassin's Creed Revelations was a decent end to a perfect trilogy. Let's dive into it. First off, we're going to take a closer look at the overall story and narrative of the game, including some of the standout characters. Like I mentioned, there really isn't much to come after in terms of picking this apart and finding any major flaws with it. The game took on the ambitious task of wrapping the story of not only one, but two iconic assassin protagonists. Something the game pulled off really well, brilliantly balancing the time jumps and switches between our two characters, giving Ezio, who has lived through so much tragedy, the happy ending he deserved, and heavily building on Altaïr overall, developing him more as a character than AC1 perhaps ever really did. In addition to our protagonists, the game introduces a wide array of new characters, setting aside almost every familiar face we've gotten to know throughout the last two installments of the trilogy, at the most only mentioning them by name. A perhaps slightly ambitious move, but that works really well, especially considering this is set in a much different part of the world a few years later. A number of side characters are introduced, from associates to enemies of Ezio. Most notably standing out are the Turkish mentor Yusuf Tassim, Prince Suleiman, and of course Ezio's love interest Sofia Sartor. The antagonists of the game, like Manuel Paleologos and Prince Ahmed, aren't necessarily the most developed nor memorable antagonists, but really they don't need to be. Ultimately, the game's main premise is not centered around the Assassin-Templar conflict in Constantinople. Really, it's something Ezio unplanned and unwillingly gets caught up in, sort of on the side, in his search for the memory seals, his primary goal and objective. Hence, this game did not need antagonists on the level of Ezio's nemesis Rodrigo Borgia, someone who is portrayed and shown off as more diabolical and cold every time we see them, only growing our resentment towards them, and someone who has wronged us to the point where it's personal. Ahmed almost crosses that line towards the end of the game, kidnapping Sofia, threatening her life, pressuring Ezio to exchange the acquired memory seals for her. Mentioned assassin companion like Yusuf is, at least compared to the ones of the last games, not necessarily the most developed character either, but based on the same principle as our antagonist, he doesn't need to be. Mostly early on in the game, we do see enough of him and together with Ezio to get a proper impression of his personality, traits, sense of humor and more anyway. Enough to feel a sense of shock finding him murdered in the beginning of Sequence 8, having returned from Cappadocia. Sofia develops throughout the game, with Ezio's admiration and adornment for her increasing with every encounter. Having lost Christina, we know what this growing relationship means to Ezio, feeling happy for him, knowing she is his second chance, hence making it devastating was anything to happen to her. Going back to the overall plot and story itself, like I mentioned, there really isn't much to pick flaws at. It cleverly found a way to tie in the legendary assassin protagonist and setting of the original game into a new narrative, even one-upping it, fully going back to the familiar castle and village of Masyaf where it all began. Revelations has what is arguably one of the coolest and most iconic openings of the franchise, brilliantly reusing the epic CG trailer featuring Ezio monologuing in the coolest way possible, showing his journey across the Middle East, to him arriving in Masyaf, proving age of 51 is just a number, one-man armying his way through an army of Templar soldiers like an absolute beast. Hence capture being distracted by visions of Altaïr, leading to near execution. Our hero avoids it, picks himself up after a superhero landing, putting his hood back on, and from there the game smoothly transitions from CG to gameplay. From there, we are served a well-structured, decently paced, 9-sequence long main story. perfectly setting up and executing the essential storylines, offering some of the most action-packed missions in all of the franchise, taking us from Syria to Turkey. From being dragged at high speed across terrain, falling dozens of feet and surviving, the amount of things in Sequence 1 alone that should have killed Ezio, Greek fire guns, a mid-air fistfight and whatnot, Revelations truly did not hold back in terms of fun, over-the-top action. As mentioned, the game perfectly balances the switches and time jumps between our two assassins, figures mostly staying with Ezio, then once or twice throughout a sequence, typically towards the end, having acquired another memory seal following some of the most fun missions of the game, reminiscent of the secret vaults and layers from AC2 and Brotherhood. We unlock yet another shrouded part of Altaïr's life. From young assassin, being forced into exile at middle-aged, to becoming a myth and legend, returning to Masyaf as an old man, reclaiming his rightful position and title as mentor. Everything is tied together in the iconic and powerful ending of the game, Ezio having reached Masyaf, unlocking the library, finding the final memory seal, and paying respects to his brother, before ending his journey as assassin. No books, no wisdom, just you, fratello mio. Despite a more or less perfect narrative, the way the playing experience itself captured this had its highs but also its swings. As mentioned, we were offered some of the most fun and action-packed missions to date, while other parts that were definitely strong narratively felt thin gameplay-wise, mostly consisting of simple dialogue sequences or cutscenes, some better than others. This probably mostly relates to the ending of the game, especially coming off the two previous games with In Bocca al Lupo and Pax Romana being some of the best final missions of the series and everything such should be. Could these parts have been executed differently in a way that kept the narrative strength but offered a more memorable playing experience? Maybe, maybe not, and honestly I'm not sure as to how else it could have been pulled off. It is what it is and is certainly satisfying to say the least. Main story aside, one aspect where Revelations unfortunately feels thin is the world itself and remaining gameplay and side activities. AC Brotherhood took everything AC2 did well, repeating and enhancing all that while throwing in new things too, offering such a wide and fun variety of gameplay and activities, from the Romulus layers, war machines, glyphs, Borgia flags, feathers, Copernico missions, other secret locations and so much more. Brotherhood truly had a bit of everything that could keep you entertained and doing something new for a long time. Unfortunately, it feels like this game took a step back. The vaults and lairs, which are one of the best parts of the trilogy and a fan favorite, are severely missing among other things. Any of such that I explored is mostly done so throughout the story, and in the open world there are only 2 of such missions, exploring Hagia Sophia as well as the lair of Vlad the Impaler, all in all only making for about 20 minutes of gameplay, latter of which isn't even part of the standard edition of the game and only accessible through the purchase of DLC or playing the Ezio Collection version. In general, while there isn't a total lack of still somewhat fun side activities to do, everything there is feels like it can be crossed off a bit too quickly, and feels thinner overall and just doesn't reach the heights of Brotherhood. Genuine side missions with the structure of main missions and optional objectives, like the Romulus layers and war machines, lacked severely among other things. Moving on to the map and world of Constantinople itself. Most of the city itself, its surrounding highlands and canal with dozens of ships entering and departing was beautiful. Climbing to the top of the Galata Tower, watching the sunset over the city with Jesper Kid's track Istanbul playing in the background is such a vibe and one of the cinematic highs of the game. Compared to the cities of Italy explored in previous games, it does however feel like Constantinople to some extent lacked the vibrant colours, charm, vibe and livelihood of Rome especially. One part of this might be that this is a much different city, driven by a different culture in a different part of the world, in which there is nothing to come after, but this might also be related to set missing gameplay elements, making the world feel thin overall. Returning to the subject of the game's story and narrative, we of course also have to touch upon a different aspect of that, the modern day. This game differs from the modern day we have been used to up till this point, setting aside Desmond, Sean and Rebecca being on the run, and instead being set inside the core of the Animus, really centering around Desmond's character, diving into his mind and past. We finally put a face to the otherwise mysterious Subject 16, who we up till this point have only known by voice, partial digital recreation, and I guess blood too. 16, also known as Clay Kasmarek, is crucial to the modern day narrative, helping Desmond navigate the Black Room aka Animus Island, even sacrificing himself to save Desmond when the Animus has scheduled the island for deletion. There are several things to tap into in terms of this different approach to the modern day storyline. I suppose you could say the linear suspense and dynamic flow seen in AC2 and Brotherhood doesn't really come across here, given everything takes place in a space outside the real world, and wants to do something else in terms of narrative. The overall premise that Desmond is in a coma, being in the Black Room is the only thing keeping him alive, having to relive the remaining memories of Altaïr and Ezio to achieve a sync nexus and wake up again, there is not much to pick apart here. While the gameplay itself differs from exploring Monteriggioni and cool ancient Roman temples like in Brotherhood, and it can perhaps feel very new if not odd at times, what we ultimately get instead in the form of the Black Room and the 5 different journey memories, giving a glimpse into Desmond's past, actually works pretty well and makes for a nice change of pace, allowing for an almost sandbox-like platformer side game, while also serving as excellent character background and development for Desmond. All in all, the game's modern day segment definitely brought something new to the table that may not be the game's strongest suit, but that ultimately doesn't drag the game down either, both from a narrative and gameplay perspective. Finally, also in continuation of touching upon the modern day, we are going to talk about the game's story DLC, The Lost Archive. Relying upon the same platformer concept as Desmond's 5 journey memories, this DLC definitely stands out and differs compared to Battle of Forlì, Bonfire of the Vanities, and the Da Vinci Disappearance from previous games, in the same sense as the standard Black Room does compared to the usual modern day. Also in terms of DLCs we're used to versus what we get here. Could the game have had a more normal DLC featuring gameplay as we know it, taking us through an additional memory sequence? Maybe, but what would it have touched upon? Revelation's story as it is goes perfectly full circle with no real holes to fill, and exploring something like, say, Ezio's journey to the Middle East, although briefly, is shown in the beginning of the game and probably wouldn't have benefited the story in any real way, really just serving as a bonus for the sake of it. I can't really think of anything else that would have made sense to show, and although a different style, a DLC like this is ultimately the best choice. This DLC is deep in more ways than one to say the least. Throughout 7 memories, we properly explore the complicated life and past of Subject 16. From his family, becoming an assassin, being captured by and held at Abstergo, discovering Lucy Stillman's true allegiances, to his demise and more. Navigating the Animus core rooms throughout these 7 memories, we experience peaceful, suspenseful, as well as quite eerie digital landscapes, accompanied by soundtracks which has either a quite chaotic, taunting, simple, or this beautifully tragic tone to it, perfectly capturing the feeling of going through the Animus core learning of Clay's life. Overall, said beautifully tragic tone comes across throughout the whole DLC quite brilliantly, especially towards the end, reaching the cotton candy sunset sky, thinking you're almost out of this, only for the loop to kick in and be back where you started. Best explained, it's like experiencing a story you know there's no happy ending to, but it makes the most of while you're in it, being surrounded by and going out to this peaceful yet bittersweet ambience. Breaking the loop, having collected all 20 memory fragments, experiencing the real ending, has a more eerie and mysterious tone to it. We see an email being typed meant for Clay's father, ultimately serving as a goodbye letter, saying he's found his purpose and to make amends. All in all, while the gameplay style was different, the sandbox platforming is set made for a nice change of pace, and narratively this DLC is one of the strongest, making up for any nitpicks there might be. To wrap things up, all in all, AC Revelations gave us one of the deeper and strongest story narratives of this series, ambitiously yet pulling off tying together and wrapping the stories of multiple characters. Where the game slightly loses its strength though is in the playing experience itself, at points turning narratively strong story missions into mere dialogue or cutscenes, and having an open world that just doesn't offer the same fun or variety in side activities as the game's predecessor delivered so brilliantly. And that sums it up for this deep dive and my thoughts into how Assassin's Creed Revelations was a decent end to a perfect trilogy. What do you think about the game? Do you agree with the things said in this video? What did it do right and what could it have done better? Let us know in the comments and let's get the discussion going. Make sure to also like and subscribe and follow the ones who came before, one of the leading AC fan communities, on our socials for more content on everything Assassin's Creed. I have been Gargudon for the ones who came before. Stay safe and active, Assassins. Till next time.